Hello, everyone. This is John Vegas. Welcome to Maximizing Potential, a place where we discuss critical theories, insights, and practices that you can use to live a fuller life, achieve your desired goals, and maximize your potential. I'm excited to introduce you today to Dr. Bill Crawford, who is a highly sought-after speaker and author of numerous business books. Bill was named Vistage Speaker of the Year in 2019, and Dr. Crawford holds a master's degree and a PhD in psychology from the University of Houston. He's also a licensed psychologist, author of 8 books, and an organizational consultant. Over the past 30 years, Bill has created over 3,500 presentations for organizations such as Sprint, Shell, the American Medical Association, Vistage, and many others, both nationally and internationally. His 2 PBS specials on stress and communication have been seen by over 15 million people. And he has been quoted as an expert in publications such as the New York Times, Entrepreneur Magazine, Investors Business Daily, Chicago Tribune, and Working Mother, just to name a few. Bill, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, John. I'm really looking forward to sharing information with you and your listeners. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, personally, I'm excited because I've read some of the work that you've published, particularly around the brain and around leadership, and really helping us how to be more conscientious leaders. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
So I understand you've created a system to help leaders really think about leadership.
Yes.
Would you want to share that with us?
Sure. When I was getting my PhD, I kind of took a course called The Biological Basis of Behavior. And in it, I learned that everything we think and feel and do and say, how we react to others, how others react to us, all has to do with how the brain processes information. So I've spent the last 30 years of my life creating a system, a philosophy, a framework that actually shows people how to access their best by accessing a very specific part of the brain. And how to avoid the stress, frustration, anxiety, the stuff that gets in the way of our clarity, confidence, and creativity by avoiding a specific part of the brain. I call the system Life from the Top of the Mind, written a book about it. It's what I go around the world teaching. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you and your audience today.
That's awesome. Now, I know that you've obviously presented to a number of different organizations and leaders. What have you found to be some of the more significant questions that leaders are wrestling with?
People want to know, how do I bring my best to a situation when I'm dealing with difficult people, supply chain issues, not being able to find the right people, my people leaving, my kids, my spouse, my family, bad drivers. In other words, what I like to do is kind of help people get really clear about what gets in the way of their clarity, confidence, and creativity. And then I show them how actually that triggers a certain part of the brain, and it throws us into another part of the brain, middle and lower brain, that actually gets in the way of our ability to think clearly and be creative and be successful.
That's great. As someone who's been reading recently about the brain, I'm always fascinated by the complexity and all the activity that's happening within our brains, right? And our reactions to stimulus or different activity that kind of we're presented with. So how do you simplify and help people understand what's happening in the brain so that people are more conscious, we're able to both maybe slow down, process, and understand?
Yeah, the brain's very complex. People spend their lives studying the brain. So what I try not to do is kind of get into all the labels and the things that you see in the pictures. I basically divide the brain into 3 parts: top, middle, and lower brain. Top of the brain's called the neocortex. This is what I call the top of the mind. That's where my Life from the Top of the Mind philosophy comes from. Middle brain's called the limbic system. Lower brain's called the brainstem. The key is the middle brain, because this middle brain gets the information first. It acts as a gatekeeper, or in today's terminology, it acts as a scanner, a processor, and a router. It scans incoming data, processes it or interprets it, and then either routes it down to the lower brain or up to the top of the mind. The problem is this middle brain has a negative bias, because as long as we've been on the planet, it's been keeping us alive by making sure that we're worried or anxious or afraid of bad things happening. So it kind of pays more attention to negative data than it does positive data. And unfortunately, it has a tendency to interpret almost all negative data as dangerous and throws us into the part of the brain that's designed to deal with danger. And that's where we get angry, stressed, frustrated, annoyed, and we minimize our ability to be effective.
Interesting. So that's it sounds like the fight or flight syndrome that most of us experience most of the time. So why is it that our brain is more conditioned to either process, focus on, or dwell on the negative than it is on the positives?
Because as long as we've been on the planet, this middle brain has kept us alive by worrying about bad things happening. You know, not too long ago in our evolution, when we were walking through the jungle or we were being thrown out of the village, that was a dangerous situation. So there was a whole lot of danger in the past. And so the middle brain got adapted to sensing danger. Unfortunately, the neurological part of the brain hasn't evolved as quick as our society has. So it's still kind of misinterpreting difficult people, difficult situations as dangerous, throwing us into the part of the brain that's designed to deal with danger. This is where we get angry, stressed, frustrated based on certain chemicals. It's actually a chemical change in our brain and body. So I help people understand what's going on. Basically, data is being sent to the wrong part of the brain. And then I give them a model for shifting from that reactive brain to the more purposeful, proactive brain so they can begin to regain control and bring their best to the situation.
That's fascinating. So if I were to just interpret it for myself, right? I mean, it seems like some of the things you're suggesting is you help people really understand how to slow things down, maybe process information for what it's worth, maybe instead of reacting. So what are some of the things that you see that the most effective leaders are able to do or have trained themselves to do that maybe the rest of the other leaders are struggling or wrestling with?
They're able to look at their emotional reactions and understand what they're all about. So many people see emotional reactions as a signal that something is really wrong and I need to do something about it. And that, unfortunately, traps us in the lower brain. But what effective leaders are going, wait a minute. If I get angry, if I get stressed, if I get frustrated or annoyed, is that really going to help me be effective? You know, there are 4 questions that I like to ask that actually help the top of the mind regain control. Number 1, is what I'm feeling, have I chosen, is it feeling it's on purpose? Did I choose to feel this or did I find myself feeling this? Number 2, is this really effective? Is this helping me create the results I want? Number 3, and I love this one, especially for leaders, is this how I want to be defined? Do I want to define myself as someone who reacts to difficult people in difficult situations with anger, stress, frustration, annoyance? And the 4th one, which most people tell me are more powerful than all 3 put together, would I teach or recommend this reaction to someone I love? And boy, that just hits home, because as a parent, you know, we would never recommend our kids be angry, stressed, frustrated, annoyed, defensive. So what that does is it allows the upper 80% of the brain, the top of the mind, to evaluate the lower brain reaction and determine, nope, it's not doing it on purpose. It's not helpful. It's not how I want to be defined. And no, I wouldn't recommend it to someone I love. So then I encourage people to flip to, all right, now I know what I don't want. What do I want? And so here's where you say, if I were dealing with this situation in a way that was more purposeful, in a way that was more effective, in a way that defines me the way I want to be defined, and in a way I would teach to someone I love, what would that look like? What qualities or characteristics would I be bringing to the situation? So it's not just about feeling less stressed or less angry or less frustrated. It's flipping to clear, confident, creative, centered, influential, purposeful, resilient, all those qualities or characteristics that help us be effective.
That's very powerful. I particularly like the question of, am I getting the results that I want, right? Sometimes we find ourselves, you know, hyperactive in a system without necessarily stepping back. But then also, are we showing up in the way that we want to show up, right? Which is the conversation I often have with leaders. I want to pivot it. Oh, go ahead, please.
Especially as leaders, because I always talk about leaders, you know, we are the kind of the powerful people in the room. We are the people that people look to as how powerful people get things done. So we're in a position where people will emulate what they see us do, which has us becoming very effective when we're doing it very purposefully, not so effective when we're doing it reactively.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And I can see that in the leaders who are highly effective, right? Talk about the inspirational leader, but it's often far more around how are they showing up and what impact they're having, which is great. Well, I wanted to pivot slightly and talk a little bit about, you know, with the pandemic and everything going on in a hyper-competitive environment, and leaders probably more stressed than ever. One of the common things that I hear when I'm talking with clients is, you know, the inability to sleep, or to slow my brain down, or to stop thinking, right? So what's your assessment of the current state of leaders, and maybe perhaps some of the things they're wrestling with, and insights that you'd be willing to share that could be useful?
Sure. So having gone through, 2.5 years, 3 years of COVID and all the disruptions that it's caused, and, even people, close to us getting sick or dying. I mean, it was a really, really terrible thing. And remember what the middle brain does. It looks for negative data and emphasizes it as, oh my goodness, we should be worried about that. So unfortunately, the middle brain has been feeding off of this COVID experience in a way that's made thinking clearly even harder. So now we're coming out of it, but we're coming out in a new world. People don't want to come back to work, and people, want to do things differently. And there's not enough people to find to fill the positions, and there's a supply chain issue and all the things that we're dealing with post-COVID. And that just puts leaders again in that reactive state. So the more the leaders can say, okay, here's the situation. Let me make sure that I have chosen qualities or characteristics that I want to bring to the solution. So how do I want to be? Let me make sure I'm defining myself first versus trying to tackle something externally. So it's kind of an internal to external experience versus trying to fix everything and everyone out there so that I'll feel okay about that.
I love that. I love that. It's kind of the adage of the people say, like, when you're on an airplane and they drop the masks, put your mask on first, and then you can obviously help others, which I think it's really valuable, right? Sometimes we forget that it needs to start here within us first as leaders. I want to build on something you said, because I do think I hear this question a lot from leaders, right? Particularly in the return to work environment and dealing with so much change. As leaders are struggling with at the individual level, at their group, right, the executive teams or leadership teams they're a part of, and then within larger organizations, how can they or should they be thinking about their own leadership around and maybe showing some either empathy, or I know you have some expertise in this area of empathy, and I would just love to hear more about it.
Yeah, there's a funny thing about empathy. One of the things I've noticed about empathy is that really, really nice people have a tendency to empathize too much. They think if I just show understanding, then everything will be fine, which isn't true. Other people don't want to empathize at all because it sounds like I'm agreeing with them, and I certainly don't agree with them. There's a wonderful TED Talk out there by a person by the name of Frances Frye, F-R-I-E. She's the dean of the Harvard Business School. She said there are 3 things necessary for people to trust us. So it's a TED Talk on trust, how to engage trust. And I think whenever we're talking with someone, we want people to trust us. She said the first thing is logic. Now, we know what we're saying makes sense to us, but it's got to make sense to them. If it doesn't make sense to them, they can't trust us. The second thing is authenticity. They have to know that we care enough about them to find a solution that works for them as well as us. And the third thing is empathy. So when I'm talking about empathy, and empathy is part of part 3 of my model. So there's part 1 is how to get to the top of the mind. Part 2 is how do I rewire the brain so that I stay in this upper 80% of the brain. And part 3 is how do I get other people to shift from their resistant brain to their receptive brain so we can create true solution-focused conversations. And empathy, as you might imagine, is one of those steps in part 3. It's a 6-step process. But really, to me, it ought to take about 2 seconds. It really doesn't take that long. Something like, I can see how you'd see it that way. I can see how that would be important to you. And then you use a magic word, and the magic word is and, never but. You never say, well, I can see how this would be important to you, but we've got a job to do. But will negate anything that comes before it. But and creates a bridge to, okay, I get it, and what if, and you start asking questions about the solution in the future, what I call top of the mind questions. So empathy, what it does, it frees the person from the need to defend their right to think and feel what they think and feel. As long as someone's in a defensive or offensive position, they're not in a receptive position. So empathy is a really important component to get them to shift from that into more of a receptive position.
That's great. Yeah, and the power of joining people, right, and meeting them where they are, as opposed to trying to pull people in your organization in a given direction.
Dragging them kicking and screaming into where you want them to be, right?
No question. That's great. Very powerful. Thank you for sharing that. I know that you've also done some meaningful work in the areas of parenting. And so I know a lot of leaders out there are parents and are thinking, well, this maybe applies to work, but how does this apply at home?
Sure. Yeah, one of the things I always want to do whenever I'm doing a presentation is give people information they can use both at work and at home. Because, it's not like we're different people. We're the same person, and we need to be able to use the skills pretty much everywhere. So one of my 8 books is called How to Get Kids to Do What You Want. And what that's really all about is how do I engage my child in a way that teaches them a quality or characteristic I want them to have when they become an adult. And a lot of times I think when we're trying to get our kids to obey us, obedience isn't necessarily a quality or characteristic we want them to have when they become an adult. We don't want them to just do anything anybody tells them. We want them to have their own kind of self-confidence. So one of the things I do in my parenting workshops and my parenting books is I teach parents how to engage the cooperative part of the brain and move out of the resistant part of the brain. And kids, when they get criticized or hurt or punished, have a tendency to go to that either shame or blame or resistant brain, and they can get stuck down there, and it can get really bad, especially when they become teenagers. So one of the things I always help parents do is say, okay, always be modeling the qualities or characteristics you want them to have when they become an adult, which means you can't teach respect without being while you're being disrespectful. You can't teach cooperation when you're being uncooperative. So it's this out of the making them do what I want them to do to engaging them in a way that's teaching them a quality or characteristic I want them to have when they become an adult. And that engages the upper 80% of their brain.
I love that. I mean, it sounds a lot like role modeling, right? I mean, showing up the way you want to show up, but also, showing the behaviors and the qualities that you think are important, as if it's going to do as I do, not as I say.
Because kids will do what they see us do. There's that song "Cats in the Cradle." My boy grew up just like me, so they want to be just like us, and they'll model what we do, and that kind of gets ingrained in their brain about how powerful people get things done. So I always tell my parents, anytime we're interacting with our kids, we're teaching them something. Let's make sure we're teaching them something on purpose versus just what we're trying to get them to do in the moment.
Nice. Very nice. I know you talked about this a little bit earlier about resistance and, and thinking about, again, how you show up with what end in mind. But I know you've also done some work around dealing with difficult people. I think you even wrote a book about how do you deal with difficult people. And invariably I tell, leaders, look, we work with people are complex beings. But so what advice would you have for leaders who have individuals in the organization who may be difficult or perceived as being difficult?
Yeah. First thing to recognize is that when people are being difficult, they're coming from the difficult part of their brain. This is normally a fear-based part of the brain. They're probably afraid you don't like them, or you won't listen to them, or you're going to blame them, or you're going to shame them, or you're going to not care about them. But if I can see difficult people as frightened versus difficult, coming from that fear-based part of the brain, then our job as leaders is not to stop their worst. It's to bring out their best. So one of the things I talk about leaders is whenever you're working with someone, you always hold an image of who they are at their best, not trying to stop their worst. You're not like, if you'll just listen to me, if you quit being so stubborn, that's just people getting defensive. But if you'll ask the question, if they're part of your organization, what do they do really, really well? Because that's who they are when they're coming from the upper 80% of the brain. And that's the part of them you're going to want to bring out. So my model is, number one, whenever a leader goes into a conversation, you always want to be clear about, what do I want to bring to the conversation? What are the qualities and characteristics I want to bring to this conversation? So I don't go in worried. I don't go in frustrated. I don't go in stressed, angry, resentful. I go in modeling, being the kind of person that I, believe is going to be effective. So I'm bringing my best, I'm bringing out their best, and then I go into a model of actually tapping into what's important to them and getting them to shift from that resistant brain to the receptive brain. But it all starts with making sure that I'm not trying to stop their worst, I'm trying to bring out their best.
I like that. I mean, what I hear you saying from my perspective, right, is both around being more intentional and reflect around what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. Right? It's kind of thinking versus doing. I think we're so focused sometimes on doing versus maybe spending the appropriate amount of time either analyzing, thinking, considering. That's great. Now, I've dealt with difficult people in organizations before, both as a leader and then as someone who's coached CEOs. I also think, what would your perspective be on the value of people who are difficult, right? Because I've seen sometimes people get perceived as difficult, when in the reality is that maybe they're just a contrarian, or maybe they're bringing a challenging point of view. And so what do you think leaders can learn from maybe some of the people who are either perceived as being difficult or challenging in organizations?
Very few people wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to be a difficult person. That's just not
I
what
love
they
that.
do. So in their mind, they're not being difficult.
Mm.
In their mind, they're just defending a perspective. There's something that's important to them.
Mm.
Often what I've seen leaders miss is they just go to the solution. They just try to convince them of the righteousness of their solution. They don't find out what's important to them. And that is the leverage. That's the key to getting people to shift to hearing what I have to say is important to, if I can, here's a good example. If, Stephen Covey talks about the third alternative, which is blending what's important to them with what's important to us. But our leverage in getting people to hear what we want them to hear is to frame what we have to say in terms of what's important to them. So part of the model that I teach people is, what do you want to bring? What do you want to bring out? You listen and learn what's important to them. So you make sure you know that. You empathize so they know you get it. And then you ask a solution-focused question, a solution-focused, future-focused question that blends what's important to them with what's important to you. And then you go to problem solving. So problem solving is actually the last step of the model. Step 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 set up the problem solving.
I love that. I love that you've created a system around it, right? Which is really a way how to think about it sequentially. But I also like the fact about going to solution-based as opposed to just going problem-based.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
That's very powerful. So I know that you've received several prestigious awards from Vistage, one being a Speaker of the Year for Canada, but then also winning it in 2019 for Vistage globally. So tell me a little bit about that and kind of, what led to that award.
Yeah, I got into Vistage because I wanted to do more of what I do. I was making as much money as I wanted to make, but I wasn't as busy as I want to be. And I got into Vistage and I found out the people in Vistage are very special. The people who commit to being in a Vistage group really kind of put their money where their mouth is. They come, they're open, they're eager to learn. They want to learn from speakers. They want to learn from each other. And they devote, that one day a month, which is not a small thing, to the process of helping them kind of work what they call on the business versus in the business, so they can get that perspective. And I've just seen people get tremendous value out of that, because, a lot of, they talk about it's lonely at the top. Sometimes you got folks around you that basically just want to tell you whatever they think you want to hear, But a Vistage group is those trusted people that and you care about, and they care about you, and they can give you that feedback. And then you've got the speaker in the morning. So for me, it's been a really wonderful opportunity to share my system and my philosophy with people who are eager to learn. And then, sometimes come back and work with their organization and kind of share some of this with their people as well.
That's great. Yeah. And I know that you've spoken over 700 groups, and I know it's quite an accomplished group of speakers. So for you to have won these awards, that's terrific. Just one question around peer advisory boards, right? For people who may not be familiar with a peer advisory board, what do you see as the power and benefit of being in a peer advisory group?
It's that ability to bring an issue to people that you trust. They're generally not in the same business you're in, but they've gone through a lot of the same things you've gone through. And sometimes they've done it in a way that can go, well, when I was going through this, we were able to do this and this and this. You go, wow, that's great. Tell me more about that. Or there's resources that they have, but it's just again, this advisory experience that people at the top don't often have. And so when you can do that with a group of people that you trust, and that's something that I've noticed, we were talking about trust earlier, something that I've noticed that is really a hallmark of a Vistage group is that ability to trust each other. And that means you can kind of, be frank with the other person without the other person getting offended. And there's a lot of value in people being able to really say, well, I don't think that's right at all. And here's my perspective, but it's done in they call it carefrontation, the whole idea of being able to confront in a caring way. And that way you get really good information and really good feedback that, you can take or leave as you choose, but you've got people you trust telling you that.
That's great. And it's hard to find environments, right? Particularly for a lot of leaders where they can be open and be honest and be themselves and trust. So that's terrific. I know you've done a lot of really powerful work on helping people access their best selves. So I really appreciate you sharing what you've shared with us so far today. How could our listeners learn more about you and or get access to connecting with you and learning more about your work?
Sure. I've got a website, and it pretty much goes through my philosophy and my trainings. I've got a YouTube channel. It's got about 500 short videos on there. It just hit 1 million views, so I'm really excited about that.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah. And also, I've got a really unique philosophy about working with organizations. I call it integrity-based pricing. It basically says, I believe I'm working with people of integrity and that they have probably a pretty good idea of what they can spend to bring me in. If you will just get me the maximum that is, I will do your event, speak to your organization for whatever that is. So it allows me to work with a whole lot of organizations that have a lot of different types of budgets and allows me to kind of go out and do more of what I love to do. So you can read more about it on my website, or you can contact me from the website if you have any questions about me or the philosophy or the book or anything like that. I'm happy to give you my best thoughts.
That's awesome. Well, I love your energy and your passion, in particular an area that I think is sometimes hard for many of us to understand as someone who's reading a book on the brain right now, right? Sometimes it can be too theoretical, and I love how you make it very practical. And I've really built it into a model and a methodology that leaders can apply both at home in parenting, as you mentioned, or at work, which frankly both are critically important to us as leaders. So thank you for that.
My pleasure. Yeah, when I graduated with my PhD, I said, okay, Bill, you've learned a lot of cool stuff, but let's just go out and not let's kind of information. Let's put it into a system based on neuroscience that people can understand and implement immediately.
Great. Well, I know that this field is growing in significance and importance, particularly the field of positive psychology. So it's great to be with you and really appreciate the work and the contributions that you're making to this community. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate, again, taking the time, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Looking forward to that as well. Thanks so much.
Take care, Bill.
You too.